Everyone can hear me? All right. Thanks everyone for coming. This is Supercharge Your Kubernetes Developer Workflow in Visual Studio Code and IntelliJ. My name is Etan Shaul. I work in Google Cloud. I've been at Google for about 3.5 years now, and I'm very happy to be back here in Shanghai.
And my name is Talarico. I'm also a software engineer on Google Cloud. I've been working on developer tools there for about the last 5 years. So today we're going to talk about CloudCode. What CloudCode is, it's an integrated set of tools that help make your Kubernetes and cloud native development experience easier. So what we do is we try and solve a couple different problems. We try and solve problems for developers and for the DevOps side of things. So who here in the audience is a developer? Show of hands. Good, a lot of developers. Awesome. Any DevOps people? One. Okay, got a handful of them too. So we got tools for everybody here today. So for the developers, what we try and do is we try and abstract away the complexity of Kubernetes. We let you write your code. As you're writing your code, in the background, we can build, deploy your images however you like to whatever cloud you like, anywhere Kubernetes is running. So if you're working on Amazon, Azure, Google, Alibaba, wherever it may be, if it's Kubernetes, you can make your deployments there, and we handle it. So you just worry about writing your code, and you let the extensions and the tools do the rest of it. On the DevOps side, we have tooling to let you understand the state of your cluster better. So we give you a nice view in a tree view. We'll hopefully have some time to look at that. And you can kind of see all your services, your deployments, your pods, and you can see the health of those and easily drill down into them and inspect logs. You can inspect events and all those things you need to understand. On top of that, we do a little bit with YAML too, because we know who's here, his favorite thing is to write YAML. We got one crazy guy in the front. I know him. I don't think that's true. But for you who don't like to write YAML, we have some snippets and some templating to make that easier for you and not as complicated. So Etan's going to go ahead and talk a little bit more in depth about exactly what CloudCode has to offer.
Okay, great. Thanks, Ian. So most of this talk is going to be demo, but just to set some context, I'll give you a quick high-level overview of some of the features of CloudCode. But before we do that, just so we can see what everyone in the room is using, how many people here use one of the IntelliJ-based IDEs, like IntelliJ IDEA, Golang, PyCharm? Cool. And what about VS Code? About half and half. And just for fun, what about something else like Vim or Eclipse? Or Emacs? Cool. Okay, so let's take a look at some of the features. So the Kubernetes inner development loop, what is that? So say you're tasked with building a microservice or a bunch of microservices that need to run on a Kubernetes cluster. One of the first things you probably want to do after setting up basic things like version control and so on is figuring out how to actually run your application locally. So you can fire up a web browser and hit the endpoint if it's a web app, testing to make sure things work properly, and then going back to your code, making changes, and then iterating. So in other words, an inner development loop. And since we're running our code eventually in a Kubernetes cluster, it's probably pretty important that your local development environment mirror production as closely as possible so that you can catch bugs early. And this means running inside of an actual cluster. And so this could be any cluster. It can be Minikube, Docker for Desktop cluster, it can be on GKE, Azure, AWS, and so on. And as you'll see in the demo, CloudCode makes it very easy to set this up. So with a single click, CloudCode will take care of building your image for you, pushing it out to a registry, doing the deployment. It'll even watch for changes in your source code and then surface them live on the cluster when something changes without needing to switch context and drop off to the CLI and run Docker commands or kube control commands and so on. Debugging. So say you run into issues in your code. One thing you probably want to do is be able to set up a debugging experience. So just the standard IDE debugging, like setting breakpoints, stepping through code, running expressions, and so on. And remember, since we're now running our code inside of a container in a Kubernetes cluster, if you've ever tried to do this, you know this isn't so trivial. It's a little bit messy to try to set up debugging against an actual cluster. You have to figure out how to set up the correct language-specific debug configuration, do the port forwarding, attach the remote debugger, and so on. So as you'll see in the demo, CloudCode will help you here. Again, with a single click, without any configuration needed, you'll be able to debug your code as if the application were running outside of a container locally, except you're running inside of a cluster with the full fidelity. Cluster browsing. So now that you can set up the inner development loop, the local development experience, debug your code, one thing you might want to do is get some insight into the state of your cluster. So looking at pods, checking to see if they're healthy, maybe stream logs from a container and so on. And CloudCode will help here. So without switching context directly in your IDE, will enable you to do that in the form of an IDE cluster browser. So since these are IDE plugins and extensions, obviously we provide templates and editing support, things like auto-completion, quick documentation, various things to help you editing all of the YAML. And we provide integrations with popular tools and libraries. So for example, Skaffold, which powers a lot of the local development experience and also the debugging that I talked about, it's integrated right into CloudCode. Skaffold also works with Helm, so if you're using Helm, everything will just work. We also have integrations with Jib, so for you Java developers out there, Jib is a Java image builder, which lets you easily containerize your Java applications without needing to have a Docker file, even without having to run a Docker daemon locally. And if we have time, I'll show a little bit of that. And lastly, if you happen to be using Google Cloud Platform, GCP, we also have some key integrations there. So for example, we have an API browser. Lets you discover available APIs right from your IDE, things like the Google Cloud Vision API, which I'll show you a little bit in the demo later. So you can discover that API, add the associated client library directly to your build, even do things like set up authentication right from the IDE, creating service accounts and adding roles. And we also provide integration with Stackdriver Debugger, which is Google's production forensic debugger. Works similarly to regular debugging, except you set snapshots which don't halt the execution of the application. Okay, great. I promise that most of this will be demo, so I'm going to hand it off to Ian now to kick off the demo.
All right, thanks everyone. So hopefully you're not too sick of us talking yet. I'm going to talk a little bit more and then we'll get into the demo here. So up here on the screen, just to give you an idea of what we're building, what we've built today, we have a bookshelf application. The application itself is pretty simple. It's just a place where you can add books, cover some information about the book. From our architecture, we see here we have a bookshelf front end, that's our UI, and a worker. The worker talks to an image recognition service that Etan has written that does some fancy stuff for us. And the bookshelf app talks to some storage APIs, and the image recognition service talks to some vision and book APIs to help us out understanding what's happening. So you can see here that big gray blob or square shape is just our representation of our Kubernetes cluster, and that can be anything. It can be Docker Desktop, Kubernetes, anything, Minikube, GKE, AWS, Azure, whatever you want to run on, it'll work with any Kubernetes cluster. So I'm going to go ahead and jump into our demo real quick here. We're going to start out with VS Code. I'm going to place this mic right here. Let me know. Can you guys still hear me? No? No?
I'll hold it.
All right. So thank you, Etan. So we're going to jump here into VS Code. So here, one more time, who here uses VS Code? Nice, perfect. This part's for you. So we can see here I've got VS Code up here. In the left-hand side here, we have our CloudCode view here. You can see here I've got a cluster, and like Etan was talking about, we have some browsing here. So just to get started, so say I'm a new user, I'm new to Kubernetes, I'm new to CloudCode, I don't really know what to do. We have some templates, and we can type CloudCode, and we see here a list of all the contributions we make, and I'm going to start with a new application. So a new application is just going to give me a list of applications I can test with. So there's a Hello World and the Bookshelf app, and you can just kind of use these as a starting point to understand, to look around, to see how everything works. The Guestbook app is actually based similarly off this Bookshelf app we have here. So I'm just going to go ahead and start out with this Guestbook app so you can take a look at it real quick. Just going to tell it where to put it, and this is just, we have a GitHub repository of samples, and all it's doing is doing a git clone. It's pulling down all the needed configuration and setup there, and it's cloning it to our machine. I think the conference Wi-Fi is taking a little bit longer than it normally should. So while we're waiting for that to come on down, I'll show you here on the left-hand side here. We can see all of our, oh, there it goes. Real quick, we can see the deployments and pods. So stuff we already have deployed here. You can see here, I'm not sure if you can see, there's a little green dot, if it's viewable there, this is giving me the state of the application. If it's yellow or red, there's something wrong with my application. So we're going to jump back to the code here. So this is the template we just created. So we have a .idea folder for those who are IntelliJ users to help you get started. Our .vs code folder, which has our launch instructions, tasks, and other configuration for debugging. We, of course, have Kubernetes manifests. We have some source. And then, as we've mentioned a couple times, something called Skaffold. And this is kind of the engine under the covers that's doing all of our deployments for us. And we'll talk a little bit more in depth about what Skaffold is later. So we're going to go back to our code here. So we have our application. And I'm going to go back here, and I'm just going to do a deploy. And you see here we have two different deploys. When I say cloud code deploy, there's deploy and continuous deploy. Deploy just does one single deployment, building your images, pushing them off and deploying them, while the continuous deploy is kind of what Etan and I were talking about at the beginning, which does a continuous deploy, and it sits and it waits for changes to your code. And as you're working and saving your changes, it's rebuilding your images, pushing them and deploying them. So I'm going to go ahead and do a deploy, and I'm going to deploy it to my development environment, which is running on GKE. And we can see here, right off the bat in the bottom here, we're kicking off a build and deploy. I built this just before the talk, so hopefully it won't take too long. But while this is going, I'll go ahead. Oh, just like that, it was done. The Wi-Fi has come back. Perfect. So here we see that we're waiting for our deployment to roll out. And just like that, we have an IP address at the bottom of our screen. I can open that, and now I can see my bookshelf application. So I'm going to go ahead and start off here. I'm going to add a book. Let me see. Okay, everyone can see that. So I'm going to use the book Cloud Native Infrastructure. Anyone here read that book? No? Okay. Pretty cool book, written by Justin and Chris. If you want to learn about some pretty crazy cloud native infrastructure, I say you should give it a read. I don't remember when it was published, so sometime. The description, it's a super cool book. Let's say super cool book, and all I'm going to do now is I'm going to upload an image of the title, or the book. So now we're going to hit save, and just like that, hopefully the Wi-Fi will be kind to me. There we go. We have our book in our bookshelf. So me being the person that loves books, loves Kubernetes, I think all Kubernetes books, all books are pretty cool. So I'm going to go ahead here, and just to show you how this works, I'm going to go ahead and start editing my application. And I'm going to edit the description of every book that comes in. And I'm going to say every book is a super cool book. And then I'm going to go back here, and I'm also going to add a space so it looks right. So I'm going to hit save here. And as soon as I hit save here, we can see now that our deployment is kicking off again. So without me having to do anything, every time I'm changing my files, the deployments just start. So while this is running, I'm going to go ahead and jump back into that Skaffold file to give you an idea of what's happening. So in this Skaffold file, we see here, we have different, a version and a config, which is saying this is a config, and ways to build and deploy. We set up profiles, which just kind of gives you the notion of where I'm deploying and how I'm deploying. So for this instance, I'm using a dev and a QA. We see here our build is based, it's just telling us we're building the image and we're sending it to a repository, and our deploy is based on kubectl. And of course, we have our manifests here, and you can see here dev manifests. We have our QA, and our QA here, again, we're doing the same build, but this time we're using cloud build. So when we're doing our QA builds, we want a little more consistency. We want to be able to track how the builds are done. So we're doing them on a remote build, so it's consistent for Etan and I. And then again, we have our deploy again. We're using kubectl. And our manifests again, here we have QA. So you can see the differences here, the cloud build and the QA. But everything else is the same. And we can do, of course, continuous deployment with our QA or our dev. All right, and again, this is deploying is taking some time. The Wi-Fi is a little rough today. So I'm going to go ahead and jump back into the Explorer so we can take a quick look here. So we have some pre-deployed stuff so you guys can see what is happening here. So for instance, we have our deployments. We have all of our pods and our services. And we can see right now with all the green here, everything's healthy. We also have the notion, we show you your replica sets, any service accounts and secrets you may have, as well as config maps. And then also for the custom resource definition. So right now, this is not, there's not a lot of support here, but we're working on adding support so you can easily browse and view custom resources in a better way than you do now and have a more integrated view. So still taking some time here. So we can go back and we can look at our deployments. And some other things we can do with this is we can work with that YAML. So from the DevOps side of things, we can go ahead and edit our YAML or view our YAML. So what this is going to do is it's going to pull our server YAML. And we can see here just like this is just grabbing our most recent YAML from the server. And you can see all sorts of different information here. And if you want, I'm not going to do it now since we're in the middle of the deployment, but you can actually change stuff. So I could say I want to have, instead of one replica, I want to have 2 replicas. And I would hit save, and it would ask me if I would like to apply this change. And that would just do a kubectl apply. Great, so it looks like our deployment is finally finishing up here. Almost. There we go. All right. So our deployment is now out. Perfect. So we can go back to our application here. I'm going to go back to my bookshelf. I'm going to go ahead and add another book real quick. I'll add the same book again. It was written sometime. Super nice book. And then I will choose the same title, and we'll hit save again. So there we go. We have the book. It says nice book, as well as the super cool book, the addition there. So we didn't really have to do anything, and just like that, we can make changes that are automatically propagated to our Kubernetes cluster and deployment. So Etan and I, being the slightly lazy engineers that we are, we added a feature called AutoAwesome. And what that does is it takes away the necessity for title, author, date published, and we can get most of that information from the image of a book cover. So we're just going to grab that, and we click AutoAwesome, use the image to get book details, and I'm going to hit save. And so now this is doing, it's calling the service that Etan wrote, so it's calling the image recognition service, which is making some calls out to Books API and a Vision API to get this information and understand it, and then sending it back. So it's taking a little bit longer, but it's actually taking even longer than I expected. So I think something's probably wrong with this request. I'm going to go ahead and stop this request and go back to the books here, and we see we still have 2 books. So I'm going to go ahead and go back to my to Visual Studio Code. I'm going to go ahead and go to the debug, and I'm just going to attach a debugger. So this is just your launch configuration, your debugger. And now we have attached a debugger just like that. So now we've attached a debugger to a cluster that's running remotely off our machine. So we're able to live debug our application without really having to do anything else. It's just using a pod selector to decide which pod to connect to. So I'm going to go ahead and just go back to my source code. I'm going to set a few breakpoints, see if we hit them. I always also like to catch uncaught exceptions because I think that's probably a safe thing to do. If something's going wrong, that might be the problem. And we're going to use AutoAwesome here again. Choose my title, and I'm going to hit save. And so now, just like that, we see we hit a breakpoint running on our Kubernetes cluster, which is remote, away from our machine. And I'm just going to start moving through some of these breakpoints. And just like that, I see an error pop up here, unable to read a file. And we see here on our side panel, we have an exception, request to image rec service, it might be a little hard to read, is not found. So what's happening is I was trying to make a call to Etan's service, which doesn't exist on my development cluster. So I think we kind of know what's wrong now. We know that there's something wrong because the service is missing. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to stop debugging here. And you can see here we're waiting for changes. I'm going to stop our deployment, and I'm going to make a deployment to QA. But first of all, I'm actually going to delete this line because I don't think we want that in our QA environment. And I'm going to do a single deployment to QA. And that's just going to go ahead and kick off another deployment. And hopefully Etan can deploy his image recognition service to QA, and everything will work end to end. I'm not going to show you this deployment because it'll be kind of boring. So I'm going to go ahead and hand it off to Etan. Thank you.
Cool. Thanks, Ian. So let's get this hooked up. Looks like we're connected. Yep. All right. So like Ian said, we're going to build out the image recognition service. And I already started building the service before the demo, and it happens to be written in Java, so I'm using IntelliJ IDEA here. This is the standard welcome screen. Like I said before, CloudCode will work in all of the JetBrains IDEs, so if you're working with Go, you can fire this up in Golang, Python, and PyCharm, and so on. And just to quickly show you, here's the CloudCode plugin installed. All right, so let's go ahead and open up the image recognition service. And immediately here, you can see a notification here prompting me to create some Kubernetes run configurations. So I'm gonna accept that prompt. Let's full screen it. Okay, so we have 2 new run configurations here. And these are analogous to the commands from VS Code that Ian talked about. Kubernetes deploy, which does a single deployment to a cluster, and continuous deploy, which does a deployment to a cluster, but will then keep the process open, watch for changes in your source code, and then surface them on the cluster. Let's quickly take a look at the structure of our application. So open up the POM here. So this is a Java app, like I said. Happen to be using Spring Boot, and we're going to be using the Cloud Vision API to extract some features from the book image, from the book cover. We also have a scaffold.yaml here. Ian kind of went into detail, so I won't talk about it too much. So the default profile here is using the web dev YAML. We have a couple Kubernetes manifests here, one for dev, one for QA. And our default profile here is deploying using kubectl, using the web dev YAML. And just very quickly, looking at the source code, we have a simple controller and a service that does the feature extraction. But let's just run things and check to see how things look. So I'm gonna use the continuous deployment. Let's open it up and edit it. So like I said, this watches the dependencies of your Docker image for changes, and then it'll build and redeploy your application to the cluster. Automatically detects the scaffold.yaml configuration, and just to point out, you can bring any Kubernetes application here, and CloudCode will work. We even have some ability to auto-generate the scaffold YAML for you. And we're gonna use the default profile, and let's choose our context. So the cluster that we want to deploy to, I'm gonna deploy to Docker for desktop, and let's apply that. So now I'm gonna run this in debug mode. Let's open up the event log. Okay, so Skaffold, which is the tool that's running under the hood, is now building our application, building our image, pushing it out to a container registry. You can see some information here in the event log showing you the status of the deployment. You can see here that it did some port forwarding for us. So it port forwarded port 8080, which is the default application port for Spring Boot. If you notice here, it also port forwarded port 5005. This is for debugging. So this is the standard JDWP, the Java Debug Wire Protocol. It's the Java debug protocol. This is a standard port that they use. So it automatically did the port forwarding for me since I ran this in debug mode. So it looks like my application, my Spring application is now running. So I can switch over to the browser and let's test it out. So I have this test endpoint right here just to kind of show you, oops. Just to show you what's going on. Is that big enough? Yeah. So it's just a simple form where I'm gonna upload an image and we can test things out. So let's choose this book right here, Kubernetes up and running. I'm sure a few of you have read this. So let's select the book and upload it. So now it should be calling out to the Cloud Vision API and the Books API to extract some of the features from the book cover. There we go. And so I have it printing out some of the things that it's doing behind the scenes so we can take a look. So this is the JSON payload that it's producing. And here, just so you can see some of the annotated book cover with bounding boxes of some of the features that it found, like the title, the author, and so on. So this payload mostly looks good. So it actually completely looks good. So let's go back into my code and quickly show you. So let's say I wanted to change the description, and instead of showing this long description, I actually wanted to show the subtitle here, like dive into Kubernetes, future of infrastructure. Let's take a look and see how we can do that. So I'm gonna set a breakpoint right here. This is where it's calling the Books API, and I'm gonna upload this book cover one more time. there we go. So just like that, I hit the breakpoint. This is an application running inside of a Docker for desktop cluster, and I'm able to debug my code. So let's just quickly run an expression. So volume info.get description. So yeah, this is what we currently are displaying, but let's see if there's a subtitle field. Yeah, so there's one here, and yeah, dive into the future of infrastructure, and that's actually what I want to show instead. So I'm going to just make the change right now. So get subtitle. And at this point, I could do a redeploy, go through the entire pipeline, rebuild my image, and do the deployment, but I don't want to wait that long. So what I'm going to do here now is hit Command-Shift F9, which basically tells IntelliJ just to recompile this file. So let's open up there we go. So IntelliJ detected that the class was changed, and it's prompting me to reload it. So I'm going to hit yes. And here you can see, so the class was reloaded, and basically what it did is it just hop swap the change for me. So at this point, I can go back to my application, choose the same book again, and let's upload it. And of course, we still hit the same breakpoint. Let me remove it. And there we go. So now we have the updated description. Didn't have to do any redeployment. At this point, I'm happy with the payload. I'm ready to deploy it up to the QA environment to test it end-to-end with the bookshelf application that Ian created. So I'm going to go ahead and kill the continuous deployment process. And at this point, the only thing left to do is to point to the web QA YAML. So I'm going to reopen my Skaffold file, and it looks like I already did it here. So I have another profile here called QA. Let me just go through this manually so you can see. So I'm going to create a new profile, and we want to override the deployment configuration here. And I'm going to give it the strategy, the deployment strategy. In this case, I want to use kube control, but it also supports Helm and Kustomize. So I'm going to select kube control, and then I'm going to override the path to the manifest. Kubernetes web QA. Yeah, so that looks good. So now I'm ready to deploy it up to the QA environment. So I'm going to select Kubernetes deploy. Let's edit it. Instead of the default profile, CloudCode detected that I have a new profile called QA. And instead of Docker for desktop, I want to deploy it to KubeCon China 2019 bookshelf QA. And I'll tell the logs just in case something goes wrong. So let's run that deployment. So now it's going to go through the entire cycle again. It's going to build the image, push it out to the registry, and do the deployment. It should be quick since I already did this. So the application was built, and now it's deploying. And the deployment was complete. So at this point, let's go ahead and test it end-to-end. So here's the bookshelf application that Ian showed you previously. Let's go ahead and add a new book. And we'll use this AutoAwesome feature that Ian talked about. And this time, let's use the same book that Ian showed you before, and hopefully things work now. So I'm going to click Save. And now it should be making a call out to the service that I just built to extract all the features for me. And there we go. So it extracted the title, the author, and the subtitle as well, Patterns for Scalable Infrastructure. And so now I'm happy with the application and everything works. Great, let's go back to the presentation. All right, recap. Let's just quickly recap what we just saw. So you saw us in both IntelliJ and VS Code set up this inner development loop with a single click or a single command execution. We were able to deploy an application to a cluster and have CloudCode watch for changes to our source and then surface the changes live on a cluster, giving you a local development experience that feels like actually running your code locally, like a traditional development server, for example. We also showed you one-click debugging. And our applications, in my case, I was running my application in a Docker for desktop cluster. Ian was running his application on GKE, and with a single click, we were able to set up this debugging. And Ian showed you a little bit of the resource browser. Peeking into your cluster, looking at your pods, streaming logs. And just to point out, this feature is coming very soon to IntelliJ as well, so stay tuned for that. And lastly, we showed you a little bit about the editing support that we have, so editing some of your YAML configuration. Great, and that concludes our talk. Thank you very much for coming. We have a URL up here if you'd like to try it out. We encourage you to try it out. You can visit the GitHub page as well and post issues and feature requests. And we have our email addresses up here if you have any questions, and we'll do our best to get back to you. And that's it. Thank you very much for coming. And we have a little bit of time for questions.
So my question is this an open source project or is a product from the Google Cloud?
Right, so we have issue tracking on GitHub, but the source right now is not open. This is a new project. We're trying to make sure we get it right, and once we're ready for community contributions, we're going to consider opening it up. But right now, we're just trying to make sure we get the experience working well.
Yeah, I just wonder how it works and what's the architecture behind this demo. So I don't see any architectures, diagrams, or how it works.
So how the application works, or how the plugin works?
How your plugin works.
So here's Ian talked a little bit about this architecture right here.
You're asking about the plugin, not the code we showed here, correct?
Right.
Yeah, so it actually mostly relies on a project called Skaffold. So under the covers, it's using Skaffold to do all the builds and deployments, and that's an open source project. So actually, if you want to go ahead and check out that, it's GitHub/Google Cloud Platform/Skaffold with a K, SK. So that is open source, and that will give you the bulk of the infrastructure that's doing the builds and the deployments for the code.
I understand, but it's also Skaffold. It's just a building tools. So I mean, so you have a debugging server and the client, and you communicate with each other, right?
Right. The debugging feature is a combination of infrastructure that Skaffold provides and the IDE. So Skaffold, what's happening under the hood with the debugging? So I showed you debugging the Java application, right? So what it was doing under the hood is it was instrumenting my Kubernetes manifest to add an environment variable, to add the JDWP configuration. Mm-hmm. It didn't actually mutate my local configuration, but it did it at deploy time, actually. So Skaffold instrumented the manifest for me, and it also took care of doing the port forwarding. And so then the plugin, using events coming in from Skaffold, was then aware of this transformation, and then was able to hook up a debugger into the port that it forwarded for me.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much.
Yep.
Hi, it looks great for the developers, for them to deploy it automatically. How does that work with the QA team and operation team? Could you give us some bit of background on how that works?
So the extension is mostly focused on the developer experience, as well as some information for the QA team. So what your QA team or your DevOps team is going to do, they're still going to have the traditional roles set up and all the configuration. So that's not really going to change. But we don't necessarily provide support for helping with the roles and the lockdown and security and stuff like that. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, thanks.
Okay.
All right, no more questions? Okay, cool. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.